Don't touch that door. This room is for professionals, not cleaners. The words cracked through the hallway like someone snapping a ruler across bone. 12 interpreters had already failed inside the glass-walled boardroom, but somehow the only person being barked at was the man holding a mop. And the executives didn't whisper their contempt. They sharpened it, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then the impossible happened. The cleaner paused, just for a breath, and quietly repeated a phrase the delegates had been arguing over, in their own dialect. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below, because the moment that boardroom froze, everything you think you know about ordinary people is about to shift. The building's tension pulsed through the marble floors, the muffled arguments leaking through the double doors behind him. But instead of reacting, the man just lowered his eyes, gripping the handle of the cleaning cart, as if steadying himself for a storm much larger than the insults. Nothing in his posture hinted at anger. Nothing revealed the truth he carried. But this was the moment everything would start to unravel. For them, not for him. He breathed out slowly, calm, unshakable. Because this wasn't just another shift. It was the day the world stopped underestimating him. Taryn arrived 2 hours earlier than usual, slipping into the corporate tower before sunrise, before the building flooded with people who treated him like part of the furniture. He preferred those quiet mornings, when the hallways hummed with air vents instead of ego, when polished glass didn't yet reflect pity or dismissal. He wheeled his cart past the executive floor, hearing the distant rehearsals of interpreters being tested for accuracy. 12 of them, 12 trained specialists flown in from different cities. And yet every voice that drifted beyond the frosted doors sounded tense, clipped, uncertain. He kept walking, wiping a fingerprint from the chrome railing as he passed. The reflection of the hallway flickered against the metal surface, catching the faintest hint of exhaustion in his face. He hadn't slept much. Aaliyah had been restless again last night, her therapy exercises leaving her drained. He promised her he'd pick up extra shifts, promised he wouldn't lose the insurance that paid for her treatment, promised he'd keep things steady. This job wasn't glory, it wasn't identity. It was survival. Taryn stopped near the janitor's closet, adjusting the strap on his worn gloves. The latex snapped faintly, the sound echoing softer than his thoughts. He could already feel it. Today wasn't going to be easy. Something in the air vibrated like a wire pulled too tight. The corporate tower was never quiet on negotiation days, but today felt different, urgent. Elitist urgency always trickled downward, and he knew who would absorb the fallout if anything went wrong. He pushed the cart toward the service corridor, mindful of the executives rushing past him in tailored suits, none bothering to step aside. He angled the cart carefully so he wouldn't clip anyone's briefcase. Their voices swirled around him, impatient, tense, blaming everything except themselves. Interpreter 7 said the same thing. This dialect isn't matching the documents. I don't care. Handle it. If this fails, Corvell is going to lose the entire contract. Just keep the staff out of sight. They're already making the guests uncomfortable. He kept his eyes low. He'd learned long ago there was safety in invisibility. Then the first tremor hit the air, raised voices inside the boardroom, sharp enough that even the passing intern stiffened. Someone slammed a folder. Someone else muttered a phrase he recognized instantly, not because he understood the language, but because he understood the mistake in it. The interpretive phrasing was wrong, completely wrong. It wasn't an insult. but it sounded like one if handled poorly. His chest tightened. He swallowed it down. Not his place. Not his world. Still, the echo of that misinterpreted phrase kept ringing in his mind. A reminder of something buried, something he hadn't let surface in years. He reached the end of the hall just as a young intern burst through the boardroom doors, bumping into him and knocking a full tray of coffee across the floor. The scalding liquid splashed across marble, streaking toward Taryn's shoes. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Just please clean it up before they see." Before he could respond, a commanding voice snapped from inside the boardroom. "Get maintenance to handle that mess, and tell him not to come near the table again. We need competence in here, not clutter." The words hit like cold water, familiar and cutting. He stared at the spreading coffee, felt the sting, then forced himself to move. He dropped to one knee, pulling towels from the cart, absorbing the spill while conversations thundered behind him. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't care if he heard. But he did hear. All of it. Every frustrated exchange. Every attempted translation. Every piece of a puzzle that 12 professionals had failed to solve. And as he wiped the floor, the truth pressed against his ribs, soft but relentless. He knew exactly why none of them could fix this. He also knew stepping in would put his job at risk. But losing that job, losing Aaliyah's therapy, losing the fragile stability he'd built, that wasn't an option. He breathed in, folded the towel, and looked up at the boardroom's frosted glass. The world saw a janitor kneeling on the floor. But inside that room, a crisis was brewing, and only he understood the language of it. He stayed kneeling for a moment longer, towel in hand, staring at the blurred silhouettes moving behind the frosted glass. The boardroom vibrated with tension, sharp gestures, raised, voices, the strained rhythm of people pretending they were still in control. Taryn rose slowly, wrung the towel out over the bucket, and pushed the cart aside just as another interpreter hurried past him, looking pale and defeated. The door shut again, cutting off the hallway in a sudden hush. For a second, he allowed himself to breathe. Then the muffled argument surged again. He didn't want to be part of this. He never wanted any of it. He just wanted the building quiet, the shift uneventful, the paycheck steady enough to cover Aaliyah's next therapy cycle. But the crisis in that room was growing claws, and every misstep inside meant pressure outside. Pressure that always slid downhill and crushed whoever stood closest to the bottom. Today, that was him. He stepped back, gripping the cart as if preparing to move, but he didn't. Something inside him, small, unwelcome, persistent, refused to turn away. The mistake they were making echoed in his head like a warning tone. He blinked hard, trying to silence it. But the training he'd buried years ago didn't care about convenience. Once you recognized a pattern, you couldn't unsee it. The hallway speaker chimed softly. "Executive suite briefing. Failure risk threshold approaching," an automated voice announced. Cold, clipped. The kind of system meant to alert leadership teams, not cleaning staff. But he heard it anyway. Right then, Mila Rowan rounded the corner with a stack of documents pressed to her chest, her expression tightly composed. She wasn't like the others. She acknowledged the staff, never with pity, but with genuine presence. So when she saw the wet towels, she slowed. "They spilled again?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Happened fast." Her eyes flicked to the boardroom door. "It's rough in there. Dialects are slipping. Tempers, too." She hesitated, lowering her voice. Just stay clear until they finish. Corval's on edge. He almost smiled at the understatement. But before he could say anything, the boardroom doors flew open again. A different interpreter stepped out, ashen, sweating, avoiding eye contact as he walked like someone trying to leave a battlefield behind him. One of the executives shouted after him, "We can't use that phrasing. It's completely wrong context. We're losing them." Taryn felt the words hit like a stone in his stomach. The phrasing they were arguing about, it wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophic. The delegates would hear it as an insult to their lineage, not their policies. A cultural fracture point, a negotiation ender. His pulse kicked up, but he stayed silent. He had one job here. One. Clean, don't get in the way, keep the insurance active. He reached for the cart, ready to push it down the hall, when the door opened again and Mila slipped inside. This time, he heard her voice through the crack before it closed. "We have maybe 15 minutes before they walk. 12. Interpreters down. We're out of options." Those last 4 words lodged into him. He swallowed hard. Out of options rarely meant the people in suits paid the price. It meant someone expendable would get cut for the budget setback. Maintenance, security, janitorial staff, people like him. He backed up until his shoulder hit the wall. The polished tile was cold through his shirt, grounding him. He rubbed his thumb over the calloused edge of his palm, the same hand that once held encrypted field notes, tactical maps, and recordings of languages most people didn't know existed. He'd sworn never to use any of it again. Not after the night everything changed. Not after he buried the uniform and tried to build something normal for Aaliyah. But the current mess was becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the boardroom, the delegates' voices spiked again. Someone slammed a fist on the table. Someone else fired back in rapid dialect. The miscommunication was spiraling, and once it reached a certain point, no one could walk it back without destroying the relationship entirely. He exhaled sharply through his nose. He didn't owe these executives anything, not after the way they treated him, not after the way Corval barked orders like he owned the air people breathed. But Aaliyah, her therapy, her progress, depended on him keeping this job. If the company tanked the contract, the layoffs would start. He'd seen it before. He'd lived it. He pushed the cart forward an inch, intending to leave. But then the boardroom's glass panel trembled under another outburst. His feet stopped moving. He looked down the hallway, weighing every possible future in front of him. If he stayed silent, he protected the lie he lived, but risked losing everything that mattered. If he stepped in, if he revealed even a sliver of the skill he'd kept buried, nothing would be the same again. He closed his eyes. Elia's voice echoed, soft, hopeful from memory. "Daddy, can we keep going? We keep. I'm getting better, right?" His throat tightened. He opened his eyes, and he turned toward the boardroom. He didn't step inside, not yet, but he moved close enough to hear every word clearly, bracing himself, not for the confrontation, but for the decision he already knew he was about to make. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let his daughter pay the price for their incompetence. Not again. He stood just inches from the boardroom door, the low hum of clashing voices vibrating against the glass. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, worn gloves, a man who blended into the walls of this place. But inside, the tension was reaching a snapping point. He could feel it. The cultural misstep had already happened, and every second that passed without correction pushed the delegates closer to walking out for good. Taryn curled his fingers around the cleaning cart's handle, grounding himself. He wasn't inside yet, hadn't said a word, but decisions were forming. Around him like storm clouds, and standing still in the hallway was no longer neutral. It was choosing silence, choosing risk, choosing to let fate decide Elia's future. And he wasn't willing to do that. He leaned slightly toward the door, not enough to open it, just enough to listen with intention. A voice on the other side clipped through the air, brittle and offended. One of the delegates repeated the misinterpreted phrase again, slower this time, emphasizing the part that sounded like a calculated insult. Another delegate murmured something sharp, and chairs scraped violently across the floor. This was spiraling. Taryn's pulse thudded in his ears, but his breathing stayed steady. Years of fieldwork conditioning didn't leave a man easily, even if he'd buried it under a mop and bucket. Then he heard Corville's voice, cool, dismissive, dangerously misinformed. "Tell them we're not insulting them. They're misunderstanding the phrasing." Taryn closed his eyes. "No," he thought. "You're misunderstanding, not them." The boardroom erupted again. He hadn't planned to intervene. Not yet. But the interns were huddling near the hallway corner now, whispering nervously about losing their jobs. A security guard lingered by the elevator, tapping his foot like a man expecting incoming disaster. Even Mila slipped out for a second, rubbing her forehead before diving back inside. Everyone sensed collapse. Taryn let go of the cart. His hands hovered in the air for a moment, then dropped to his sides as he stepped closer to the door. The handle glimmered faintly under the overhead light, stainless steel and impossibly cold. He didn't touch it, but he let himself imagine doing so. What would they even do if he walked in? Probably tear him apart verbally. Maybe escort him out. Maybe fire him on the spot. But none of those outcomes were worse than losing his daughter's therapy. None. His jaw tightened. He whispered the corrected phrase under his breath, testing the cadence, the respectful emphasis. It rolled off his tongue with ease, too much ease. This wasn't the kind of language a hobby learner accidentally mastered. It belonged to his old life, the one he'd locked away so deeply that even hearing himself speak those syllables felt like opening a sealed vault. For a moment, guilt pricked him. He had promised never to return to that identity, had promised Aaliyah he would stay safe, stay grounded, stay here. But using knowledge wasn't the same as returning to the battlefield. He wasn't stepping into danger. He was stepping into responsibility. Footsteps echoed from behind him. The failed interpreter who'd stormed out earlier came back down the hall, pacing anxiously. He muttered to himself, "I don't know why that dialect sounded so mixed. I've never heard anything like it." Taryn glanced at him, then looked away before their eyes met. He didn't want recognition. Not yet. The boardroom door shook violently as someone slammed the table inside. A chair toppled. A voice, one of the delegates, rose sharp and wounded, the type of sound a culture made when deeply insulted. That was it. They were leaving. Taryn took a slow step forward, then another. He reached the door just as Mila opened it again. She stopped abruptly when she almost collided with him, her eyes widening in surprise. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there," she whispered, brushing a loose strand of hair back. She looked exhausted, pulled thin by responsibility she didn't deserve. "They're about to pull out. If this deal dies..." Her voice trailed off. He nodded. She blinked at him, sensing something had shifted in him. "Are you all right?" No, but he hadn't been all right for years. "I'm fine," he murmured. His voice was steady. Mila didn't question it, but her gaze lingered longer than usual before she slipped back inside, closing the door halfway behind her. Through the remaining gap, he heard Corvell. Again. Louder now, desperate to salvage authority. Someone get me another interpreter. Anyone. I don't care who. Just someone who actually understands what they're saying. Taryn felt a chill run through him. They didn't have anyone else. Not in the building. Not in the city. Not at this level. And despite everything, the insults, the indignity, the years of suppressing what he knew, he couldn't walk away. Because if he didn't act, Elia would lose the one thing she needed most: stability. He placed one hand on the boardroom door. The cold metal pressed into his palm, firm and real. He didn't push it open. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward just enough to see a sliver of the room. Delegates tense. Executives frantic. Corvell barking orders. Mila trying to mediate. A world on the edge of failing not because of malice, but because of ignorance. Then he whispered, so quietly only he could hear. They're not misunderstanding you. You're misunderstanding them. And for the first time since he took this job, he knew with absolute clarity he was going to step in, not for pride, not for them, for his daughter, for the life he refused to let slip away. He straightened his shoulders, and he opened the door. The door didn't crash open. It didn't swing wide in defiance. It simply eased inward under his hand, quiet, controlled, almost apologetic. But the effect was instantaneous. The boardroom fell into a stunned silence so sharp it sliced through the chaos like a clean blade. Dozens of eyes snapped toward the entrance. Executives stiffened, delegates paused mid-argument, and Taryn stood in the doorway, his cleaning gloves still on, his cart behind him like an accidental witness dragged into the center of a storm. He didn't step fully inside. Not yet. He held the edge of the door lightly, aware of every breath in the room, aware of how out of place he looked against polished suits and multi-million-dollar stakes. But he didn't back away either. Somewhere between the two positions, between retreat and intrusion, he found his balance. Corvell's voice cut through the stillness. "What are you doing? This is a confidential meeting. Get out." Sharp, impatient, dismissive. A tone he had perfected over years of commanding rooms he believed he owned. Taryn didn't flinch. Instead, he glanced toward the delegates. Their faces were tense, grim, insulted, their refined posture tight with offense. One of them murmured the disputed phrase again, low and bitter, as if repeating the wound they believed had been delivered. The interpreter beside them winced helplessly. Taryn lifted his chin slightly, not arrogant, not challenging, just steady. "They're not misunderstanding you," he said softly. "You're misunderstanding them." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet confidence carried more weight than shouting ever could. Confusion rippled across the room. Corvell blinked at him, incredulous. "Excuse me?" Taryn took one small step inside. Just one, enough to show he wasn't backing down, but not enough to seem threatening. His heart knocked against his ribs, but his breathing stayed even. Years of training had taught him how to hold steady under scrutiny. "You're translating the phrase literally," he continued, eyes on Corvell, but voice angled across the table. "But in their region, the idiom means something entirely different. It's respectful, protective even." Every executive stared at him like he had just spoken in tongues. One of the delegates leaned forward slowly, studying him. Not the way people studied cleaning staff, but the way they examined someone who had just shifted the ground beneath their feet, He said something in his dialect, cautious, testing. And without hesitating, Taryn replied. The room froze. It wasn't perfect textbook pronunciation. It was better. Lived in, fluent, shaped by real interactions rather than academic drills. The delegates exchanged quick glances, startled by the accuracy. Corval shot to his feet. Who are you to speak during a negotiation? The shame in his voice wasn't hidden. It was irritation wrapped around embarrassment. A CEO being corrected by a janitor was not part of his corporate reality. He tried to recover control, but the delegates were no longer looking at him. Their attention had shifted entirely toward the man in the doorway. One delegate spoke again, this time faster, more familiar. A question layered with formal nuance only a native or deeply trained linguist would catch. Taryn answered without wavering. Mila stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. Corval sputtered. Are you trained in this language? Taryn didn't look at him. His gaze stayed on the delegates, who were now visibly relaxing, their shoulders softening as they realized the insult had been accidental. I understand enough to know where the confusion started, he replied quietly, and how to fix it. It wasn't swagger. It wasn't pride. It was simply truth. One of the executives whispered, Is he fluent? Another hissed back. Why would a janitor know any of this? That whisper carried a sting, but Taryn let it slide off him. They didn't know him. They didn't know the years before this job, the missions that relied on precise translation, the weight of mistakes measured not in broken deals, but in broken lives. He'd buried all of that when Elia needed him home, buried it deep. But some pieces of a man don't stay dead, not when needed. A delegate motioned toward an empty chair, an invitation. Corval bristled. This is completely inappropriate. But the delegate interrupted him sharply, speaking in accented English for clarity. We ask he stays. He understands us. The emphasis fell hard on the word he, and harder still on the word understands. Corval's jaw tightened, fury simmering beneath polished professionalism. No CEO wants to appear subordinate in their own boardroom, but refusing the request of international partners would ignite an even greater disaster. Mila stepped in gently. Sir, they're asking for him. A long, tense beat followed. Finally, Corval exhaled through his nose and gestured stiffly. Fine, but sit in the back. Speak only when I tell you to. Taryn didn't argue. He didn't need permission from Corval. The delegates had made their choice clear. He walked inside, every step anchored by a single truth humming in the back of his mind. This wasn't about respect, or ego, or proving himself. It was about protecting his daughter. He took the seat offered. The boardroom felt colder up close, heavy with expectation. Corval glared at him like a stain on the carpet. Executives whispered. Delegates leaned in, attentive. And for the first time, Taryn realized something. This wasn't the climax of the crisis. It was only the beginning. He settled into the empty chair, the tension in the room pressing against him like a second atmosphere. Conversations had paused, but their weight still hung heavy over the table. Delegates watched him with cautious curiosity. Executives stared as if trying to decide whether he was an asset or an intruder, and Corval's glare followed him like a spotlight no one asked for. Taryn rested his gloved hands in his lap, grounding himself. He didn't fidget, didn't shrink. He simply existed, quietly, steadily, inside a room that had never been meant to include him. The boardroom's chilled air brushed against his skin, but beneath the surface, the old instinctive warmth of focus stirred. He hadn't expected to sit here today, hadn't expected to speak, but fate wasn't the polite visitor. It barged in and demanded decisions. One of the delegates leaned forward, offering a respectful greeting in their dialect. The cadence was formal, ceremonial. Taryn responded in kind, matching tone, honoring hierarchy, offering acknowledgement without overstepping. Gasps rippled through some of the junior executives. One whispered, "How does he know that form?" Another whispered back, "That's a regional protocol. Only someone trained in something would use that." Corval shot them a look that killed the conversation instantly. The lead interpreter, still lingering by the side wall in humiliation, shook his head in disbelief. "I didn't even know that version existed," he muttered. The delegates, however, exchanged approving nods. Taryn didn't smile. He wasn't here for validation. The lead delegate spoke again, slower this time, giving Taryn space to catch the deeper meaning. It wasn't a test. It was an invitation. The phrasing held layers, diplomatic weight, cultural memory, honor protocols, all hidden beneath simple vocabulary. Taryn's response was measured, but fluent. He switched registers fluidly, offering not just translation, but correction, gently clarifying the metaphor that had been taken as an insult. His voice never rose above the calm authority of someone who had lived these nuances, not memorized them. Relief washed across the delegates' faces as they finally understood the misunderstanding. A soft murmur filled the room as they conferred quietly among themselves, visibly decompressing. The executives didn't understand the words, but they understood the shift. The tone was unmistakably better. Corval, though, couldn't accept it. "All right," he snapped. "You've made your point. You can leave now. We'll take it from here." Taryn didn't move. He simply said, "They're confirming that the deal can continue, if the phrasing is cleaned up." Corval blinked. What?" Taryn repeated it, this time translating with absolute clarity. The delegates nodded in agreement. The CEO's expression cracked, only a little, but enough to reveal shock beneath the surface. A hum of surprise swept through the room, and then the moment that changed, everything happened. One of the delegates asked a question, fast, layered, culturally delicate, a question no interpreter had been able to handle all morning, a question that could have reignited conflict if mishandled. Without hesitation, Taryn answered, not in stiff academic tones, not in rehearsed phrases, but with lived fluency, intonation, rhythm, context, history. His voice didn't shake. His posture didn't waver. He didn't look like a janitor speaking out of turn. He looked like a man stepping into the only role he had ever truly mastered. Mila's hand drifted halfway to her mouth, stunned. Corval stopped breathing entirely. Executives exchanged glances, realizing they had never known the man who swept their floors. The delegates leaned back, visibly impressed. One even smiled, a small but unmistakable gesture of respect. The weight of the room shifted. For the first time since stepping inside, Taryn wasn't out of place. He belonged. By the way, he added quietly to Mila without breaking composure, that last phrase, they're offering a path to reconciliation, not pushing an ultimatum. She blinked hard. How do you know all this? He didn't answer. Not because he was hiding, but because explaining would take them into a past he'd shut the door on long ago. Corval regained his voice, lashing out in frustration rather than authority. "This doesn't make sense. How would someone like you—" The lead delegate cut him off sharply, speaking in heavily accented English. "He understands us more than your hired specialists." The humiliation on Corville's face was unmistakable, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Taryn didn't revel in it. He didn't smirk. He didn't even look at Corville. Instead, he turned his attention back to the delegates, maintaining professionalism that no one else in the room seemed able to muster. Corville finally sank into his chair, silenced by the international guests choosing a janitor over him. The negotiations resumed, this time with Taryn quietly guiding the tone, correcting phrasing when needed, ensuring respect flowed in both directions. Every smooth transition, every diplomatic save, every adjustment he offered pulled the deal back from collapse. And with each small success, the room saw the truth more clearly. This man wasn't lucky. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't stumbling into relevance. He was an expert, a forgotten one. As the dialogue continued, Mila whispered near his shoulder, "You just saved this negotiation. Do you realize that?" He didn't respond with pride. He responded with purpose. "It's not saved yet." But part of him knew they were only watching the beginning of the reversal. And the building, the company, Corville, they had no idea how far the truth would go once it began to surface. Subscribe if you want to see how people react when the quiet one becomes the only person holding the entire deal together. The delegates continued speaking among themselves, their tone noticeably calmer now, their gestures less sharp. A crisis that had been seconds from detonating was settling under Taryn's quiet guidance. But the room wasn't relaxed, not entirely. The executives sat stiffly, the tension in their shoulders betraying the fear of what they had almost lost. And Corville looked like a man watching his authority slip from his grasp, grain by grain. Taryn stayed focused on the conversation in front of him. He wasn't done, not even close. A single corrected metaphor didn't guarantee harmony. Cultural wounds, once opened, didn't close easily. He leaned slightly forward, catching the subtle shift in a delegate's expression. Something was still off. A misunderstanding lingered, rooted not in language, but in tone. He waited for the delegate to finish, then translated gently. "They're saying they appreciate the clarification, but they're worried your earlier phrasing implied disregard for their ancestral lands." The room rustled with discomfort. One executive muttered, "What? We never mentioned their lands." "You did," Taryn said quietly. "Not directly, but when your interpreter tried to replace the metaphor, the version he used held historical implications. In their culture, it's tied to early colonization." Mila blinked. "That's incredibly specific." Taryn's voice remained steady. "It's also incredibly important." The delegates nodded. They weren't angry now. They were watching him, trusting him, communicating through him. They used a softer dialect variant as they explained further, almost testing whether he could keep up. He did, effortlessly. The lead delegate leaned back in his chair, studying him with an expression that mixed surprise and, unexpectedly, respect. "Your understanding is deep," he said in English, each word deliberate. "Very few outsiders know our historical idioms." Taryn didn't smile. "I was trained to listen carefully." Corville let out a humorless scoff. "Trained? As what, exactly? A janitor academy?" A few executives shifted uncomfortably at their CEO's attempt at humor. It landed wrong, mean, small. The delegates exchanged sharp looks of disapproval. Taryn didn't give Corvell the satisfaction of reacting. He simply turned back to the delegates and addressed their concerns directly. His tone matched their formality. His posture matched their restraint. He wasn't performing. He was adapting. This was second nature to him. He explained how the miscommunication had happened, why the phrasing had felt abrupt, and how the cultural gap could be bridged respectfully. The delegates listened closely, taking in every nuance. As he spoke, Mila stepped slightly behind him, her expression soft but alert, like she had suddenly realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then the lead delegate nodded, slow and thoughtful. "You speak not just our words," he said, "but our intentions." Taryn inclined his head. "It matters." The words rippled through the air with an impact he didn't intend but couldn't prevent. Even the executives felt it. Something inside the balance of the room shifted, a subtle tilt in gravity, placing him, not Corvell, at the center. Corvell saw it too, his jaw tightened. "Fine," he snapped. "If you're so capable, then translate this." He rattled off a complicated financial clause, one loaded with legal jargon and corporate terminology. Taryn didn't hesitate. He translated the clause seamlessly, then clarified one section that would have offended the delegates by implying financial superiority, an implication dangerous in hierarchical cultures. The delegates murmured in approval. Corvell's irritation cracked into something darker. Embarrassment, loss of control. "This is absurd," he muttered. "You're a janitor. A janitor shouldn't be—" But the lead delegate cut him off sharply. "Respectfully, your staff member is the only one communicating with accuracy. We request he continues leading the language bridge." The silence that followed was heavy. Executives exchanged alarmed glances. Mila pressed her lips together, fighting a smile of disbelief. The interpreter in the corner stared at the floor. And Corvell's face drained of color. A request like that wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. Taryn felt the eyes of the entire room land on him. It wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't victory. It was something heavier, responsibility settling across his shoulders. This wasn't just saving a deal. This was stepping into a place he had spent years avoiding. Still, he nodded once. "All right, I'll help." As he turned back to the delegates, something unexpected happened. One of them spoke to him, a dialect he hadn't heard in years, a rare branch used only in private familial councils, a dialect reserved for those who had earned deep trust. And without thinking, he answered in the same dialect. Gasps filled the room. Corvell's mouth fell open. Mila pressed a hand to her chest. The delegate smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. "You have studied much," one said softly. "No," Taryn replied. "I learned because I had to understand people. Where I worked before, misunderstanding had consequences." He said nothing else. He didn't need to. Something in his tone hinted at a past that demanded precision, demanded empathy, demanded fluency, not the kind found in books, but the kind forged in necessity. Suddenly, the delegate's entire demeanor transformed. They leaned closer, their posture softened. They began including him in gestures of cultural respect. And with each exchanged phrase, the negotiation began to rebuild itself. Carefully, steadily, correctly, the room had witnessed the turning point. The janitor was no longer an interruption. He was the bridge holding everything together. And for the first time, even Corvell realized. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. The boardroom air shifted. subtle but undeniable, like someone had quietly recalibrated the center of gravity. The delegates were no longer glancing at Corvell, no longer looking to the hired interpreters or the executives in tailored suits. Their attention rested entirely on the man in cleaning gloves who had just answered a private dialect question with perfect fluidity. Taryn didn't revel in it, but the room felt it, every stunned breath, every tightened jaw, every recalculated assumption. He remained seated, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. It wasn't confidence he radiated. It was competence, the kind you couldn't fake, couldn't buy, couldn't manufacture in a conference room. The kind earned in places these executives had never stepped foot in. The lead delegate leaned toward him again and asked a question layered with both diplomacy and history, a question not meant for casual conversation, a question used to measure sincerity. Taryn answered in their dialect's ceremonial form. Gasps fluttered through the room like a breeze. The executives froze. Mila's eyes widened with something close to awe. Corvell's knuckles whitened against the table's polished edge. The delegates nodded slowly, almost reverently. It was a gesture no interpreter had earned today. Not one of the 12 specialists, certainly not Corvell. But this janitor, the invisible man they walked past every morning, was receiving it with quiet grace. Taryn translated the exchange into clear English. They're confirming they're willing to restart negotiations if cultural respect is upheld. Then he added, they're offering a symbolic reset gesture. It's rare. Corvell blinked rapidly. Symbolic what? Taryn repeated it, calmly. It means they're reopening trust. It's significant. Executives sat straighter. Some exhaled the breath they'd been holding since the meeting began. The interpreter in the corner closed his eyes, half relieved, half devastated by the comparison. Corvell, however, couldn't handle the shift. This is ridiculous, he spat. We cannot let some janitor control the direction of a 7-figure negotiation. One of the delegates turned sharply, delivering a firm sentence in their language, sharp enough that even those who didn't understand felt the reprimand. Taryn translated without embellishment. They said respect isn't determined by job titles. A few executives lowered their eyes. The lead delegate added another line, gentle but unmistakably authoritative. Taryn translated again. They said communication requires the right listener, not the highest rank. If silence could bruise, Corvell was covered in marks. Mila's gaze softened on Taryn, not with pity, but with profound recognition. She'd suspected he was more than he appeared, but she hadn't expected this. Taryn continued guiding the conversation, not dominating, not overshadowing, guiding. He clarified phrasing, adjusted metaphors, softened tones, steered the emotional undercurrent. He fixed problems before they erupted, built bridges before cracks widened, reassembled trust with the precision of someone who had done far more dangerous versions of this work. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled. He didn't reach for notes or hesitate over vocabulary. He spoke like a man who lived inside languages rather than beside them. The delegates saw it. The executives envied it. Corvell hated it. At one point, a delegate turned to him and asked a layered question about the company's willingness to adopt cultural protocols. Corvell began answering immediately, his voice sharp. Taryn lifted a hand slightly. "Wait," Corvell snapped. "You do not tell me to wait in my own boardroom." But the delegates were watching Taryn, not him, and ignoring that would cost them the entire deal. Taryn turned back to the delegates. "He means yes," he said, translating Corvell's tone into something respectful. He's committed to honoring your protocols moving forward. Corvell stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But when the delegates nodded in approval, the CEO swallowed whatever insult he'd been crafting. Taryn continued, "They're asking for clarification on the legal clause you mentioned earlier. They want reassurance that the partnership won't compromise their territorial stewardship." Corvell frowned. "Territorial what?" Taryn translated again. "Their cultural lands. The phrase you used earlier implied ownership, not collaboration." Corvell stiffened, finally understanding the scale of the miscommunication. "That wasn't the intent." "I know," Taryn replied softly. "But intent doesn't translate. Tone does. So does history." The delegates exchanged appreciative nods. One said a phrase that carried a subtle hint of gratitude. Taryn translated, "They thank you for the clarification." Corvell didn't thank him in return, but he didn't argue either. For the next stretch of time, the negotiation unfolded like a delicate dance. Delegates speaking, Taryn interpreting, executives proposing terms, Taryn refining the phrasing to prevent accidental offense. He bridged timelines, histories, worldviews. He protected both sides from missteps they had no idea they were about to make. The victory strategy, public exposure, was accelerating with each exchange. He didn't hide it. He didn't diminish it. He simply did what he knew. Eventually, the lead delegate addressed him directly. "You carry deep understanding," he said softly. "Where did you learn our ways?" The question landed heavy. The room leaned in. Taryn's heartbeat thudded once, deep and steady, before he answered. "Some places I worked required listening more than speaking." A simple answer, a controlled answer, one that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. The delegates nodded in understanding. Not curiosity, respect. Corvell rubbed his temples, visibly overwhelmed. His authority had been commandeered not through force, but through undeniable competence. And the more the room saw Taryn, the more they saw how blind they had been. When a final question arose, a delicate, dangerous one, the delegates aimed it at him, and everyone else waited for his voice. He translated carefully, elegantly, perfectly. And in that moment, every person in the room realized the janitor wasn't saving the deal. He was leading it. The boardroom felt different now, charged, sharpened, almost reverent. Taryn's final translation in the previous moments had settled the room into a calm the executives had failed to reach all morning. The delegates watched him with a respect usually reserved for diplomats, not men in worn gloves. The executives watched him with a mixture of astonishment and discomfort. And Corvell watched him like a man staring into a mirror that reflected every flaw he had tried to hide. The next question from the delegates came slowly, almost ceremonially. It wasn't linguistic complexity that made it delicate. It was the meaning beneath it. A cultural test of moral alignment. A values question. A question interpreters rarely handled because it wasn't supposed to appear in Western negotiations. "Are you willing," the lead delegate asked in his native dialect, "to conduct this partnership with integrity, honoring both nations' dignity beyond financial terms?" Taryn inhaled quietly. This wasn't a translation task. This was a revelation task. He turned to Corvell. "They're asking whether this deal is about money or about honoring their people." Corvell blinked. "Isn't that obvious?" Taryn shook his head. "Not to them. They need reassurance that they're not signing away a part of themselves." Mila shifted beside him, sensing the weight of the moment. Several executives leaned in, anxiety creeping up their throats. This wasn't just cultural nuance. This was identity, the kind of question that, answered poorly, would end negotiations instantly. Corval exhaled sharply. Just tell them yes. They won't accept yes, Taryn said quietly. You have to mean it, and you have to show it. The CEO stared at him as if processing a language of emotional responsibility he'd never learned. How do I show something like that? Speak plainly, Taryn replied. Speak honestly, not like a CEO, like a human being. Corval opened his mouth, ready to argue, but the delegates were watching. He swallowed and turned forward. For the first time that morning, his voice softened. We want a partnership built on respect, Corval said. The words were slow, awkward, but earnest. We can't pretend to understand your history perfectly, but we want to learn, and we want to do this right. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't poetic, but it was human. Taryn translated it, not literally, but truthfully, shaping the tone into something culturally attuned. A few executives exchanged stunned glances. Mila exhaled a relieved breath. The delegates nodded thoughtfully, accepting the sincerity behind the clumsy phrasing. The balance of the room shifted again. This time, Taryn wasn't just guiding the meeting, he was shaping the CEO. The delegates offered a new term for the agreement, a gesture of restored trust. As they spoke, Taryn translated seamlessly, adjusting metaphor, tone, and context with precision. Each phrase he carried across the table rebuilt a bridge. Each interpretation unraveled the tension of the earlier catastrophe. And then one delegate added something unexpected. We wish for him, the delegate gestured toward Taryn, to be present for all future discussions. The executive stiffened. Corval's eyes widened with something close to panic. Future discussions? He's part of janitorial staff. He's not even trained for... He is trained, the lead delegate said firmly. Taryn felt the words thud inside his chest, awakening memories he'd spent years silencing. Training halls, operations briefings, missions where misinterpretations cost more than money. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize that kind of precision again. Mila turned toward him slowly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You really did this before, didn't you? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was beginning to leak into the room, not through confession, but through undeniable skill. The victory strategy tightened around the scene like a well-built mechanism. Public exposure wasn't a moment. It was unfolding in waves. Every phrase he translated, every expression the delegates directed toward him, every stunned breath from the executives. It all contributed to the reveal. But the poetic justice was building too. The man mocked for cleaning and nothing else was now cleaning up the CEO's disaster more thoroughly than any specialist could. Another round of discussion began. This time, the delegates switched dialects mid-sentence, a conversational pivot used only among trusted interlocutors. Taryn followed without hesitation. Corval looked physically ill. How, he murmured under his breath, how are you doing this? Taryn didn't answer. He was busy correcting another metaphor that would have derailed the discussion. His voice stayed measured, calm, gentle. He wasn't performing. He was preventing damage. He was protecting everyone in the room, whether they deserved it or not. As negotiations stabilized, Mila leaned slightly toward him. Whatever your past was, it wasn't small. Taryn kept his eyes forward. It's in the past. But it's saving their future, she whispered. He didn't allow himself the luxury of pride. but something inside him, something long dormant, stirred with quiet recognition, not of glory, not of identity, of meaning. The delegates concluded a major portion of the negotiation, pleased. They exchanged a brief private phrase before addressing the room at large. Taryn translated, "They recognize today's effort as a turning point. They say the partnership is back on stable ground." The executives exhaled loudly, as if they'd been holding their breath for an hour. One even wiped sweat from his brow. Relief rippled across the table. And through it all, Taryn remained composed. A single delegate gave him a small nod of respect before adding one final remark. Taryn translated, "They request your presence at tomorrow's continuation meeting." The room froze. Executives looked horrified. Mila looked proud. Corvell looked defeated. Taryn simply nodded. "Of course." Subscribe if you want to see what happens when the company realizes the man they tried to hide becomes the one they can't negotiate without. The words still hung in the air. "They request your presence at tomorrow's continuation meeting." For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the boardroom itself had paused to absorb the implications. A janitor had not only salvaged the negotiation, he had become indispensable to it. The delegates gathered their documents calmly, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the shock wave they had detonated across the executive floor. Taryn didn't flinch under the attention. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement, the gesture modest and controlled. His heartbeat remained steady. He'd lived through harder rooms, harsher eyes, higher stakes. But something about this moment pressed deeper than any mission briefing ever had. Because this time, it wasn't about national security or intelligence work. It was about securing a future for his daughter. As the delegates prepared to exit, a few executives scrambled to stand, nearly tripping over their chairs in their rush to appear respectful. Taryn's presence, however accidental, had transformed the power dynamic. The delegates seemed to notice the shift. One even gave Taryn a subtle look of approval as they filed out of the room. Mila stepped beside him, her voice hushed. "You handled that flawlessly." He didn't answer immediately. He watched the last delegate exit, then responded softly, "It was necessary." She studied him, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering curiosity. "You keep saying that, but most people don't step into a crisis like this unless they've done it before." He turned toward her, the fluorescent lights catching the faint exhaustion around his eyes. "Most people haven't lived the kind of life that teaches you to stay steady when everything around you falls apart." She didn't push for more, but her silence spoke volumes. She understood that whatever he'd buried, he buried it for a reason. The boardroom slowly began to empty, but Corvell remained seated at the end of the table, frozen in place. His expression hovered somewhere between humiliation and disbelief. The CEO of Corvell Global, outmaneuvered, overshadowed, and openly bypassed by a man he'd ordered to stay out of sight. Taryn expected another outburst, another insult, another attempt to claw back authority. But instead, Corvell rose slowly, almost methodically, his chair scraping softly across the floor. "Everyone out," he said, voice flat. Executives hesitated. "I said out." They scattered immediately, leaving only Corvell, Mila, and Taryn in the room. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was dense, charged, coiled with emotion. Corvell stared at Taryn as if seeing him for the first time, truly seeing him. "You've embarrassed me," Corvell finally said, voice low. Warren didn't respond. "You made me look incompetent in front of our partners." Still, Taryn said nothing. He wasn't interested in defending himself from wounded ego. Corval took a step closer. You think speaking a few dialects makes you better than the people who run this company? It wasn't about being better, Taryn replied calmly. It was about preventing a disaster. Corval scoffed. You think you saved us? If anything, you complicated everything. A janitor leading negotiations? That's a headline that destroys credibility. Mila's eyebrows shot up. Sir, quiet, he snapped, though the command lacked its usual sharpness. His gaze dragged back to Taryn. I don't know what your angle is, but I'm not letting you undermine my position. Finally, Taryn met his eyes with a quiet steadiness. I'm not your threat, Corval. Miscommunication was. Corval stiffened. The truth had always been his least favorite language. Before the argument could escalate further, Mila tapped her tablet, revealing a live notification that blinked across the boardroom's main monitor. Sir, you need to see this. Corval turned sharply as the screen lit up with an internal company chat blast. Leaked message thread. The janitor just saved a multi-million-dollar deal. Dozens of employees had commented already, some disbelieving, some praising, some surprised that the man cleaning their offices at night spoke more languages than the entire negotiation staff combined. Corval's face drained. Mila scrolled. It's spreading across departments. People are talking. No one needed that explained. Perception was currency, and this story was buying influence at a rate Corval couldn't control. Taryn stood slowly. I didn't leak anything. I know you didn't, Mila said quietly, stepping forward before Corval could accuse him. Someone in the hallway recorded the moment the delegates requested him. For future meetings. Corval's jaw clenched. Of course they did. Corporate buildings were never truly private. Cameras, phones, open doors. The world thrived on spectacle. And being overshadowed by someone you tried to diminish, that was a narrative impossible to contain. Taryn stepped toward his cart, preparing to leave now that the delegates had gone. But before he reached the door, Mila spoke again. They're going to expect you tomorrow, she said softly. Everyone saw it. He paused, his back half turned. I know. She approached him carefully, as if approaching someone carrying something delicate. Are you prepared for that? For what comes after today? Prepared? No, but he was ready. Ilya needs stability, he said. Whatever tomorrow brings, I'll handle it. Mila's voice softened further. You already did more than handle it? Corval muttered something under his breath, but it didn't matter. His authority had already cracked publicly. And poetic justice continued to unfold right before him. Taryn pushed his cart into the hallway, the wheels whispering across the polished floor. Conversation rippled from nearby offices as people peeked out to catch a glimpse of the man who had done the impossible. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't bask. He didn't slow down. Because the truth, the part no one else in this building understood, was that speaking 8 languages wasn't the most remarkable thing about him. It was knowing when to use them. Tomorrow, the world inside this tower would shift again, and he would be ready. Taryn wheeled his cart down the east corridor, the hum of office whispers following him like an echo. People tried to look discreet, pretending to check their phones or refill water glasses, but every stolen glance carried the same message. That's him, the janitor who saved the deal. He didn't react. He kept moving, posture steady, footsteps measured. Silence had always been his safest companion. But as he approached the elevator, a figure separated from the cluster of curious employees, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, wearing the badge of an internal compliance officer. "Mr. Hale?" the man asked, stepping directly into his path. Taryn stopped, hands resting lightly on the cart handle. "Yes? I'm Officer Rennick. I need a moment, privately." A few employees lingered nearby, pretending to rearrange paper stacks. Rennick shot them a pointed look, and they scattered instantly. When the hall emptied enough for conversation, Rennick's tone lowered. "You weren't on today's interpreter schedule." "No," Taryn said. "But you stepped in anyway." "Yes." Rennick studied him carefully. Too carefully. "Are you aware that stepping into a negotiation without clearance is a breach of internal protocol?" Taryn didn't blink. Letting the deal collapse would have been a larger breach. Rennick's jaw tightened. "That's not your call." It was when no one else in the room spoke the language. A long beat passed. Rennick finally exhaled, frustration giving way to reluctant acknowledgement. "You prevented a diplomatic failure. The board knows that. But there are questions." "About what?" "About you." Rennick leaned in slightly. "Where you learned those dialects. Why you're working custodial when you clearly aren't custodial. What your real background is." Taryn didn't reply. He'd lived this interrogation in different forms, under different governments, in rooms far less forgiving than this corridor. Rennick stepped back, expression unreadable. "You'll be contacted for a formal review. Don't miss it." He turned and walked away. Taryn inhaled slowly. The corporate world was different from the one he'd left, but power behaved the same everywhere. Fear first, control second, truth last. He resumed pushing his cart. Before he reached the end of the hall, Mila appeared, almost breathless. "I just saw Rennick talking to you. What did he want?" "Verification," Taryn said simply. "Of what?" "Everything," she grimaced. "Of course, because God forbid someone actually be competent without a title." Her frustration wasn't performative, it was protective. The instinct surprised him. "Taryn, tomorrow's meeting won't be smooth. Corville's furious. He's already called an executive huddle for the morning." "I expected that. There's talk about excluding you." Taryn finally paused, turning toward her. "They can't," he said quietly. "Not if the delegates request me again." "That's the problem," Mila whispered. "They know that." She moved closer, lowering her voice even more. "Taryn, you need to be ready. Today cracked something open. Tomorrow they might try to put it back together in a way that erases you." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm not trying to be part of their structure." "Maybe not," she said. "But whether you want it or not, you changed it." Before he could respond, the elevator dinged open. She gave him a small, knowing look. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's not just another day." As the doors closed, he felt the subtle shift she described. The victory strategy, poetic justice through exposure, was no longer unfolding around him. He was becoming the center of it. Taryn reached the basement level, where his janitorial locker sat between exposed pipes and humming machinery. The contrast between floors was stark. The top level dealt with million-dollar negotiations. This one dealt with mop buckets and industrial detergents. He changed out of his uniform slowly, folding each piece with deliberate precision. Routine steadied him. Years of structure didn't disappear because life changed rhythm. As he reached into his locker for his jacket, a small voice echoed down the hallway. "Dad?" His heart softened before he even turned. Aaliyah stood, there, hair in loose waves, backpack hanging from one shoulder. She always came to meet him after her tutoring session when her hands weren't too swollen to write. He crouched slightly. "You're early," she shrugged. "The session finished quick today. Miss Letty said I did excellent, but she said it all dramatic, like she was announcing an award." Taryn smiled. "Maybe she should announce it like that every time." "Maybe." Aaliyah stepped closer. "People upstairs were talking about you." He froze, not visibly, but internally. "What did they say?" "That you saved something important, that the CEO messed up and you fixed it." She watched him carefully. "Is it true?" He didn't like the worry behind her question. She'd been through enough uncertainty already. "I helped, that's all." Her eyes softened with pride. "You always help, even when people don't know how much." He felt something warm settle in his chest, grounding him stronger than any mission debrief ever had. He placed a hand on her shoulder, lightly. "Are your fingers okay today?" "A little cold," she admitted, "but better." "Good." Stability mattered. For her. For him. For tomorrow. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go home." They stepped into the night air together. The city hummed softly around them. Traffic, neon signs, distant sirens. But beside Aaliyah, the noise felt balanced. Halfway to the train station, her small hand slipped into his. He glanced down, surprised. "Is tomorrow going to be hard?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he answered honestly. "But you'll handle it." He looked at her, at the trust she carried so effortlessly. "Yes," he said again. "I will." Not because he wanted to be a hero in that boardroom, but because she needed him to be steady. Lights flickered on the skyscraper behind them, the company's logo glowing bright across the glass. Tomorrow, that building would face a storm, and Taryn would walk straight into it, unhidden, uninvited, undeniable. Morning light crept across the city's glass towers as Taryn stepped off the train, with Aaliyah's goodnight hug still lingering like a promise on his shoulder. The plaza outside Corville Global buzzed with an energy he didn't like. Employees clustered in small circles, speaking in lowered tones, all glancing toward the main entrance. And toward him. He walked with steady steps, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the phones subtly angled in his direction. He'd been watched before, surveilled, evaluated, measured, but never by people who knew so little yet assumed so much. The moment he entered the lobby, Mila hurried over, holding a tablet pressed tight against her chest. "Taryn, thank God. You need to see this before you go upstairs." Her voice trembled with urgency, not fear. She angled the screen toward him. A banner stretched across the internal news portal. Urgent executive notice. Revised attendance for. Today's negotiation and meeting below it. A list of approved attendees. Taryn's name wasn't there. He met her eyes calmly. "I expected something like this." "They're trying to lock you out," she whispered. Corvell pushed it through late last night. He's framing it as role alignment for corporate integrity. It's a way to keep you silent. Taryn's jaw tightened slightly. He'd encountered this tactic in different uniforms, spoken in different languages. People afraid of losing control always move the same way. "What time is the delegation arriving?" he asked. 10 minutes, Mila said, "and they specifically requested you again in their morning message." He held her gaze. That alone changed everything. His exclusion wasn't just petty, it was dangerous. Because if the delegates asked for him and he wasn't there, the insult wouldn't land on him. It would land on the company and on Corvell. Where's the meeting? Taryn asked. Executive Conference Room 4B. He nodded once. Then that's where I'll be. Mila stepped in front of him. Taryn, they'll retaliate. Corvell's furious. You walking into that room could escalate everything. Everything already escalated, he said quietly. I'm not going to let them sabotage their own deal to protect pride. She searched his face, then exhaled. Okay, then at least you're not walking alone. They headed toward the elevator, but halfway there, Officer Rennick intercepted them, badge prominent, expression rigid. Hale, Rennick said, I need you to come with me. Taryn stopped. I don't have time. The delegates. This is mandatory. Rennick's voice dropped. There are questions about your employment history, Mila stiffened. He hasn't done anything wrong. Rennick ignored her. Your file shows gaps, skills inconsistent with your job description, training that doesn't align with civilian employment. We need clarification. My past isn't relevant to today's meeting, Taryn said evenly. It is when the CEO believes you're a liability. Mila stepped forward. A liability? He saved the company yesterday. Rennick's expression didn't change. I'm following orders. Hale comes with me. Taryn could feel the timing tightening like a noose. The delegates would arrive momentarily. If he disappeared into a compliance room now, Corvell would claim he was unavailable and proceed without him. A controlled dismantling, a silent erasure. He looked at Rennick, calm but firm. You can question me after the meeting. That's not how this works, Rennick replied. Then call the CEO, Taryn said. Tell him you're detaining the one person the delegates specifically requested. Rennick froze. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Taryn stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you want to be responsible for blowing the deal because Corvell is afraid of being overshadowed? Rennick swallowed hard. His eyes shifted, calculating consequences. Behind him, a chime sounded, the arrival notification for the VIP elevator. The delegates were here. Mila whispered urgently, Rennick, if he doesn't walk into that room, they'll take it as an insult, a serious one. Rennick closed his eyes briefly, battling between obedience and fallout. Then he stepped aside. Go. Taryn nodded respectfully and continued down the hall with Mila beside him. The executive conference room was already filling when they arrived. Corvell stood at the head of the table, adjusting his cufflinks with forced composure. His eyes snapped to Taryn the moment he entered. What is he doing here? Corvell demanded. One of the delegates answered before Taryn could speak, voice calm, authoritative. We requested him. Corvell's jaw twitched. There was a misunderstanding. Mr. Hale isn't authorized. He is, the delegate interrupted gently. We trust his presence. It was the cleanest, most devastating blow a diplomat could deliver. Corvell's mask cracked, but he had no move left that wouldn't publicly humiliate himself further. He gestured stiffly toward a seat. Fine, let's begin. Taryn didn't sit. He stood slightly behind Mila's chair, close enough to interpret, far enough to avoid theatrics. The delegates began speaking in a blended dialect, shifting seamlessly between formal register and idiomatic shorthand. Taryn translated instantly, his voice smooth, precise, grounding the rhythm of the meeting. The contrast with Corvell's strained professionalism was striking. Executives exchanged glances, slowly realizing the imbalance. This man, this janitor, commanded more confidence in the room than their CEO. Halfway through the session, the lead delegate paused and said something unexpected in his native tongue. A soft question, a respectful one. Mila leaned closer. "What did he ask?" Taryn translated quietly. "He wants to know if my position here reflects my actual skill or a personal misfortune." The table fell silent. Corvell went pale. Taryn inhaled, choosing honesty without exposure. "Tell him," he said softly, "that my path brought me here, and I'm here to serve with integrity, no matter the title." When he related aloud, the delegates nodded with visible respect. Corvell looked as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. Poetic justice didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it unfolded gently, in the dignity of a man refusing to rise above anyone, even when everyone now looked up to him. The meeting ended with the delegates offering formal thanks, directed not at Corvell, but at Taryn. And as they exited, one of them placed a hand briefly over his own heart as he nodded to Taryn. It was a gesture of profound respect, a gesture a CEO could never buy or bury. The delegates' final gesture lingered in the air long after they exited the conference room, leaving a silence more powerful than applause. Taryn didn't move. No one did. Respect had weight, and every executive in the room felt it pressing on their shoulders. But the one who felt it most was Corvell. He stood frozen at the head of the table, hands braced against the polished surface, eyes locked not on Taryn, but on the empty doorway where the delegates had vanished, as if watching the last thread of his authority walk out with them. Mila exhaled slowly. "That was incredible." Taryn nodded slightly, stepping back from the center of the room, as though trying to shrink into a shadow that had long since stopped accommodating him. But Corvell finally spoke, his voice a brittle whisper. "Get out!" No one moved. He straightened, color rising in his cheeks. "Everyone except Hale, out, now." Executives obeyed instantly, chairs scraping in a chaotic rush. Mila hesitated, eyes flicking between the two men, then slipped out quietly, closing the glass door behind her. The silence that followed was sharp. Corvell rounded the table, stopping only inches from Taryn. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Taryn said calmly. "I helped save your deal." "No." Corvell jabbed a finger at his chest. "You humiliated me, in front of foreign delegates, in front of my staff, in front of this entire building. A janitor," he struggled for breath, "made me irrelevant." Taryn didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that people in freefall created their own turbulence. Corvell paced in short, frantic strides. "They want you back for future negotiations. Not me, not the senior advisors. You." He spat the word as though it burned. "Do you think that makes you powerful?" "No," Taryn said softly. "It makes me useful." "And that's the problem." Corvell slammed his fist onto the table. "You're not supposed to be useful. You're supposed to be invisible." Taryn met his gaze steadily. "I was, until you needed me." Corvell froze. The truth cut sharper than anything else Taryn could have said. For a moment, the CEO looked lost, like a man realizing his own mask had fused too tightly to remove. Then something dark flickered in his eyes. "I can't have you in my company anymore." Taryn finally blinked. "Are you firing me?" "No, I'm ending your contract before HR can intervene." Corvell straightened, smoothing the front of his suit. "You'll be removed before the end of the day, quietly." Taryn didn't speak. Corvell mistook the silence for defeat. "You think this was poetic justice?" Corvell sneered. "You think the universe rewards people like you? You overstepped, and now you'll disappear." A soft knock interrupted him. Mila opened the door a crack. "Sir," she said, voice tight. You need to see this. I said no interruptions. It's the delegates. That stopped him. Mila entered fully and placed a tablet on the table, turning it toward Corval. A message filled the screen. Formal notification. Our delegation requires Mr. Taryn Hale's continued presence in all negotiations. His cultural and linguistic precision is the foundation of our renewed trust. If Mr. Hale is not available, the partnership will be reconsidered. Below it, 3 diplomatic seals glimmered. Corval went pale. Mila's voice softened with restrained triumph. They sent it to the board, and to corporate headquarters, and to our global partners. Corval's throat worked helplessly, the reality closing in on him like tightening wire. You can't fire me, Taryn said quietly, not with arrogance, but with fact. Not without ending your own agreement? Corval staggered back a step. For the first time, Taryn allowed himself one slow breath of clarity. Not victory, not pride, just truth settling where fear once lived. He looked at the CEO with a calmness that came from years of surviving rooms, much harsher than this one. You asked me yesterday why I spoke those languages, Taryn said. Why a janitor had the skills your negotiation team didn't. The answer is simple. I lived a whole life before this job. A life full of roles I can't talk about, not because they're grand, but because they're gone. I chose quiet work because quiet gives my daughter stability. Corval trembled with something between regret and resentment. Taryn continued. I didn't come here to take anything from you, but I won't shrink to make you comfortable. Mila stepped closer to Taryn, her presence firm. The board wants an emergency meeting, she said. Without Corval. The CEO's breath hitched. And they want to speak with you, Taryn, she added. Immediately. Something inside Corval collapsed. Not outwardly, but inwardly, visibly, painfully. Poetic justice had reached its final beat, and it wasn't loud. It was quiet. The way truth always is when it can no longer be denied. Taryn walked to the door. Before stepping out, he paused, offering Corval a single, steady look. Not angry, not triumphant, simply honest. You treated me like a shadow, he said. And a shadow only grows brighter when you shine the wrong light. Then he stepped into the hallway where employees waited. Not with curiosity this time, but with recognition, respect. Mila touched his arm gently. Ready? Yes, he said, for the first time in a long time. They walked toward the boardroom together, a janitor no longer, but the man who rebuilt a company's future with nothing but truth. Ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad working night shift as a janitor until surgeons rushed in. Saying, "We need Dr. Hale now" title. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?